stood motionless behind the reinforced observation window, my breath creating small circles of fog on the glass as I leaned closer. The German Shepherd lay still on the steel table, its black and tan coat dulled by death. 3 years of relentless work had brought us to this moment. Project Lazarus was about to attempt its first mammalian revival. "Vitals monitoring online," Andrew called out, his voice betraying a mix of nervousness and excitement. His sandy blonde hair caught the harsh fluorescent light as he moved around the table, attaching sensors to the dog's lifeless body. The Eden facility hummed around us, a massive underground complex buried beneath the Nevada desert. Few people on the surface knew we existed. Even fewer knew what we were trying to achieve. "Serum preparation complete," Sarah said, her voice steady through the intercom. I watched my wife hold up a syringe filled with luminescent blue liquid. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and even through the glass, I could see the intensity in her green eyes, the same look she'd had when we first isolated the organism from the meteorite fragment 3 years ago. I pressed the intercom button. "All systems are ready. Proceed with injection." Sarah nodded, positioning the needle at the base of the dog's skull. This was the optimal injection site based on our trials with smaller animals. The serum needed direct access to the central nervous system. She pushed the plunger slowly, the blue liquid disappearing into the dead tissue. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. The monitoring equipment continued to show flat lines. Andrew glanced up at the observation window, his expression questioning. I held up a hand. "Wait." The first sign was subtle, a twitch in the dog's left hind leg, then another, stronger this time. Sarah stepped back from the table, her clipboard clutched against her chest. The dog's chest expanded with an intake of breath, and the monitors erupted with readings. "We have neural activity," Sarah announced, her voice clinical despite the momentous event unfolding. "Heartbeat detected." The entire team around the lab fell silent as the dog's eyes snapped open. Not the warm brown they should have been, but a milky white, as though covered by cataracts. The animal lifted its head, movements halting and uncoordinated, like a marionette with tangled strings. "Motor functions returning," Sarah noted, but I could hear the concern in her voice. This wasn't what we'd expected based on our smaller trials. The dog stood up on the table, its legs splayed awkwardly. It was alive, undeniably alive, but wrong in ways that sent a chill down my spine. The way it moved was jerky, mechanical, its head swiveling unnaturally as it surveyed the room. Despite my unease, excited whispers broke out among the research team behind me. 3 years of failures, of government oversight committees threatening to pull our funding, of sleepless nights poring over data, and now success, of a sort. "We did it," Dr. Thompson whispered beside me in the observation room. "My God, we actually did it." The dog took a tentative step forward on the table, then another. Sarah approached slowly, hand extended. "Sarah, wait," I said into the intercom. Something about the animal's posture triggering alarm bells in my mind. She paused, looking up at me. That moment of hesitation saved her. The dog lunged, not at Sarah, but at Andrew, who had moved closer to adjust a sensor. Its movements were suddenly fluid, blindingly fast. Before anyone could react, its jaws clamped onto Andrew's forearm. His scream filled the lab as blood sprayed across the stainless steel. "Security," I shouted, already running for the door to the main lab. By the time I burst into the room, the security officer stationed by the door had drawn his weapon. 2 quick shots echoed deafeningly in the enclosed space, and the dog dropped to the floor, dark blood pooling beneath it. Andrew had collapsed into a chair, clutching his forearm, his face ashen with shock. Blood seeped between his fingers. "Get me a first aid kit," I ordered, rushing to his side. One of the technicians fumbled in a cabinet, producing a white box with a red cross. "It bit clean through," Andrew said, his voice shaking as I gently moved his hand away to examine the wound. 2 semicircular rows of deep punctures marred his flesh. Blood continued to well from them, but something else caught my attention. The edges of the wounds were already turning an unnatural black color. "This doesn't look right," I muttered, cleaning the area with an antiseptic wipe. The black discoloration seemed to spread even as I watched, thin dark lines beginning to trace the path of veins up his arm. Sarah appeared at my side, her face drawn with concern. "Let me see," she said, bending to examine the bite. Her eyes widened. "Adrian, I need to take a sample of this." I nodded, finishing wrapping a pressure bandage around his arm. "How are you feeling, Andrew?" "Hot," he mumbled. Sweat had broken out across his forehead. "Really hot." Sarah had already moved to the dog's corpse, taking tissue samples with practiced efficiency. "I need to run tests immediately. Something's wrong with the organism. It's not behaving as predicted." The lab doors hissed open, and Director Marcus strode in, his silver-grey hair immaculate as always, his cold blue eyes taking in the chaos of the room. "What happened here?" "The subject revived successfully," I explained, helping Andrew to his feet. "But it attacked Andrew before being neutralized." Marcus surveyed the scene, his expression unreadable. "The resurrection protocol worked. The dog was clinically dead and then restored to life." "Yes, but..." "Then this is a success," he cut me off. "The attack is unfortunate but not unexpected. We're dealing with unprecedented science here." Sarah looked up from her microscope, her face pale. "Director, the organism has mutated inside the dog's neural tissue. It's not matching our baseline samples." "Mutations were accounted for in the risk assessment," Marcus replied dismissively. "Document everything and prepare for the next phase." "Sir," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "I think we need to pause and evaluate what happened here. Andrew needs medical attention, and we need to understand why the subject became aggressive." Marcus fixed me with a cold stare. "Dr. Cole, may I remind you that Project Lazarus has specific deliverables and timelines. The Defense Department doesn't fund us to be cautious." Andrew swayed beside me, and I tightened my grip on his shoulder to steady him. "At least let me get him to the medical bay." "Fine," Marcus conceded, "but I want a full report in 2 hours, and I expect preparations for the next trial to continue." As he turned to leave, I noticed Andrew's condition deteriorating rapidly. His skin had taken on a greyish cast, and the black veins had spread past his elbow. "Sarah," I called, alarmed. "Something's happening." She hurried over, pressing her fingers to Andrew's wrist to check his pulse. "His heart rate is dangerously elevated. We need to get him to medical now." We half-carried Andrew toward the door, but before we reached it, his legs gave out completely. His body went rigid, then began to convulse violently. "He's seizing." I lowered him to the floor, turning him onto his side. "Get a medical team here, Stat." Sarah knelt beside us, her face etched with horror as she watched the black veins now spreading across Andrew's neck and face. "The infection rate is impossible," she whispered. Andrew's convulsions suddenly stopped. His body went completely limp. I pressed my fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. He's flatlined. Starting CPR. I positioned my hands on his chest and began compressions, counting under my breath. After 30 compressions, I paused. Still no pulse. Sarah prepared to administer rescue breaths. "Wait," I said, grabbing her arm. Something in Andrew's expression had changed. Though his eyes remained closed, a muscle in his jaw twitched. Then, exactly as the dog had done, Andrew's eyes snapped open, revealing the same milky white pupils. For a moment, he stared at the ceiling, unmoving. "Andrew?" Sarah said tentatively, leaning closer. "Can you hear me?" In a movement too fast to track, Andrew sat up and lunged toward the nearest person, a female technician who had been hovering nearby. Before anyone could react, his teeth sank into her throat, tearing through flesh with savage force. The technician's screams filled the lab, blood spurting from her severed artery. I pulled Sarah back as Andrew continued his attack, his movements precise and vicious, no longer human. "Security!" someone shouted. But the guard who had shot the dog stood frozen in horror. I watched, paralyzed, as Andrew ripped flesh from the technician's neck with his teeth. Blood sprayed across the lab equipment, across Andrew's face, across the pristine white floor tiles. The technician's screams gave way to gurgling as she collapsed. Security finally responded, 2 guards rushing in with weapons drawn. "Stand down," one shouted, but Andrew paid no attention, continuing to maul the dying technician. The first shot hit Andrew in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second and third hit him squarely in the chest. He should have dropped immediately, but instead, he slowly turned toward the guards, blood dripping from his mouth, the bullet wounds in his chest barely bleeding. "Dear God," I whispered, pulling Sarah further back toward the wall. More security personnel flooded the room. More shots were fired. Andrew kept moving despite taking multiple rounds to the chest and abdomen. It wasn't until a shot struck his head that he finally collapsed. On the floor, the technician's body began to convulse. Director Marcus reappeared at the doorway, his face ashen as he took in the carnage. "Lock down the facility," he ordered into his radio. "Seal all exits, now." I watched in mute horror as the dying technician stopped convulsing. For 30 seconds, she lay still. Then, just as Andrew had done, she sat up, her lab coat soaked in blood, and attacked the nearest guard. The infection was spreading. I pulled Sarah back against the wall, one arm around her waist, my other hand gripping her shoulder so tightly I could feel her bones beneath my fingers. "Stay behind me," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the wet, tearing sounds coming from across the room. Security personnel flooded through the doorway, weapons drawn. The first guard raised his pistol and fired without hesitation. One shot, then another. The bullet slammed into Andrew's chest, the impact jerking his body backward with each hit. Dark blood oozed from the wounds, but the effect was all wrong. Andrew didn't collapse. He didn't even seem to register pain. Instead, his head rotated toward the guard with that same mechanical precision we'd observed in the resurrected dog. "Keep firing," someone shouted. More shots rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. I counted 5, 6, 7 impacts. Andrew's body jerked with each bullet, but he remained upright, blood now soaking through his once pristine lab coat. He moved forward with jerky steps, closing the distance to the guard who'd shot him. "Headshot," I murmured, the words escaping before I could stop them. "Aim for the head." One of the guards must have heard me. The next shot caught Andrew in the temple, and he finally dropped, a marionette with cut strings. The room fell into a stunned silence broken only by our ragged breathing and the soft gurgling sounds coming from the technician, Lisa, on the floor. Her white lab coat was now crimson, soaked through with her own blood. Her eyes were closed, her body limp. "My God," one of the researchers whispered. "Is she?" The question died as Lisa's body began to convulse, her limbs jerking violently against the blood-slicked floor. I knew what was coming next. We all did. Director Marcus appeared in the doorway, taking in the carnage with widening eyes. For once, his composed demeanor cracked, revealing raw fear beneath. "Lock down the facility," he barked into his radio. "Seal all exits, now." His eyes met mine across the room, and I saw in them a terrible understanding. We both knew what was happening. Lisa's convulsions stopped. For 30 seconds, she lay completely still. Then, just as Andrew had done, her eyes snapped open, milky white and vacant. She sat up with that same unnatural motion, her head swiveling as she surveyed the room. "Everyone back," I shouted, but it was too late. Lisa lunged at the nearest guard, her movements blindingly fast. Her teeth sank into his arm before he could react. He screamed, firing his weapon reflexively. The bullet tore through her shoulder but didn't slow her down. She clamped her jaw tighter, ripping away a chunk of flesh. More security personnel rushed in, weapons raised. Shots echoed through the lab, but the infected moved with terrifying speed. The guard Lisa had bitten staggered backward, clutching his bleeding arm, his face already taking on an ashen pallor. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my bicep. "We need to go," she hissed. "Now." I nodded, scanning the room for an exit route. The main doors were blocked by the ongoing chaos as security tried to contain Lisa and the newly bitten guard, who was already starting to shake uncontrollably. "The decontamination chamber," Sarah said, pulling me toward a side entrance. "It seals automatically." We moved along the wall, staying as far from the center of the room as possible. I caught glimpses of the infected as they attacked. Their movements were both jerky and precise, animalistic yet coordinated. Lisa had taken down another guard, and the first infected guard was now rising, his eyes clouded white. 5 other researchers had the same idea we did, backing toward the decontamination chamber entrance. One of them, Dr. Chen from biochemistry, punched in the access code with trembling fingers. The reinforced door slid open, and we rushed inside, the 7 of us cramming into the chamber designed for 4. "Seal it," someone shouted. Dr. Chen hit the emergency lockdown button. The heavy door hissed shut just as an infected lab technician, someone I didn't recognize, slammed against the outside, leaving a smear of blood on the observation window. The decontamination chamber was a 10 by 10 cube, with reinforced glass walls on 2 sides, offering a horrific panoramic view of the lab beyond. Red emergency lights suddenly activated, bathing everything in a crimson glow as alarms blared throughout the facility. "The ventilation system," one of the researchers said, pointing to the ceiling vents that had stopped humming. "It's shut down." Marcus appeared on the other side of the glass, somehow having avoided the infected. He was trying to use a wall phone, his movements urgent, his face set in grim lines. He slammed the receiver down after a moment, shaking his head. "Communications are jammed," Sarah translated, though we couldn't hear him through the sealed chamber. Through the glass, we had a front row seat to the horror unfolding in the lab. The infection spread with terrifying efficiency. Each victim turned within minutes of being bitten. I counted the infected as they multiplied. 4, 7, 9, 12. They moved through the lab, attacking anyone still alive, feeding on the dead and dying. Blood painted the walls and equipment in grotesque patterns, illuminated by the pulsing red emergency lights. "What's happening to them?" Dr. Chen whispered, his glasses fogged from his panicked breathing. Sarah had already moved to the small computer terminal in the corner of the chamber. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up data from our research. "The organism," she said, her voice clinical despite the horror surrounding us. "It's behaving unlike anything we predicted. I'm analyzing the air samples taken during the dog's resurrection." I watched as Marcus tried to make his way toward our chamber, skirting the walls of the lab, a security officer providing cover. They were halfway to us when 3 infected spotted them, changing direction with that unnerving, puppet-like movement. "Look at how they move," I said, pointing. "It's as if the organism has taken control of the motor functions, but doesn't fully understand how to use them." Sarah nodded without looking up from the terminal. "That's exactly what's happening. The organism is integrating with the host's neural pathways, but primarily the brainstem and cerebellum, areas controlling basic movement and coordination. Higher brain functions are shut down. The infected reached Marcus and his security escort. The guard fired, catching one in the chest. The infected staggered but kept coming. The guard adjusted his aim and put a bullet through its head, dropping it permanently. But the other 2 were on him before he could fire again, their teeth tearing into his neck and arm. Marcus abandoned him, sprinting the remaining distance to our chamber. He pounded on the glass, his mouth forming words we couldn't hear. "We can't let him in," one of the researchers said. "He might be infected." "We can't leave him out there either," another argued. Before we could decide, the choice was made for us. The guard Marcus had abandoned rose from the floor, eyes milky white, and lunged at Marcus from behind. Their bodies slammed against our observation window, Marcus's face pressed against the glass, his expression contorted in pain as teeth sank into his shoulder. I turned away, unable to watch. The 7 of us were sealed inside the decontamination chamber, surrounded by a growing horde of infected colleagues. The only sound inside our refuge was the soft hum of the emergency backup power and our collective ragged breathing. "I've got it," Sarah suddenly said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "The organism is airborne in its dormant state, likely spread throughout the facility by the ventilation system. But it only activates through direct fluid transmission, blood, saliva. So we're all infected?" Dr. Peterson, an immunologist, asked. "Potentially carrying dormant organisms, yes," Sarah clarified, "but not actively infected. It needs to enter the bloodstream to begin replication." I moved to the environmental controls, checking the chamber's systems. "We have about 2 hours of air in here before the carbon dioxide levels become dangerous. After that," I didn't need to finish the sentence. We all understood the implications. A heavy thud against the glass made us all jump. And infected, I recognized her as Dr. Keller from neurology, was pounding against the window. Another joined her, then another. Soon, a dozen infected were throwing themselves against the reinforced glass, leaving bloody handprints and smears with each impact. A thin crack appeared in the upper corner of the window. "The glass is rated for containment, not assault," Dr. Chen said, his voice rising with panic. I stared at the growing number of infected pressing against our chamber. Their milky eyes seemed to fix on us with terrible hunger, their movements becoming more coordinated with each passing minute. The crack in the glass extended another inch with each impact. "We need a plan," I said, tearing my eyes away from the horror show outside our temporary sanctuary. "Because in less than 2 hours, we either run out of air or that glass gives way." Sarah looked up from the terminal, her face pale but determined in the red emergency lighting. "I might have an idea." The infected continued their relentless pounding, the cracks in the glass spreading like a spiderweb across the surface. counting down the minutes we had left. The crack in the glass spread like a spider web, small fissures branching outward with each new impact. We had minutes, maybe seconds, before the reinforced window gave way entirely. The infected outside seemed to sense our vulnerability, their attacks growing more coordinated, more focused on the weakening points in the glass. "There," Sarah said, pointing to a maintenance hatch in the floor I hadn't noticed before. "Emergency access to the utility tunnels." I knelt down and yanked on the metal ring embedded in the floor, revealing a dark square opening and a ladder disappearing into blackness. "Everyone down now," I ordered, looking at the 5 other researchers crowded into the chamber with us. "Chen, you first, then Peterson." Dr. Chen hesitated only a moment before lowering himself into the hatch. Peterson followed quickly, her lab coat catching briefly on the edge before she disappeared into the darkness. "Move," I shouted, helping the remaining researchers toward the hatch. Sarah was checking something on the terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Sarah, we need to go now." "Just downloading the latest data," she said, eyes fixed on the screen. "If we're going to find a way to stop this, we need everything we have on the organism." "No time," I said, pulling her away from the terminal just as the data transfer completed. I guided her to the hatch and helped her onto the ladder. A tremendous crash behind me announced the window's failure. I didn't look back, just dropped into the hatch and pulled the cover closed above me. The metal rang with the impact of bodies slamming against it a moment later. The locking mechanism wouldn't hold for long. I climbed down the ladder into near-total darkness. My feet touched solid ground, and I stepped away, bumping into warm bodies in the confined space. "Everyone here?" I asked, my voice echoing in the tunnel. "Yes," Sarah answered, somewhere to my right. "All 6 of us made it." My eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness. The maintenance tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, with pipes running along the ceiling. The only illumination came from thin strips of emergency lighting embedded in the floor, casting everything in a dim blue glow. "Which way?" Dr. Chen asked, his glasses reflecting the blue light. "We need weapons," Sarah said, "and somewhere defensible." Director Marcus spoke up for the first time since joining us in the tunnels. I hadn't even realized he'd made it out of the lab. His shoulder was bandaged with what looked like a torn piece of his shirt. "The armory is on level 3, he said. "We can access it through the maintenance shaft at junction B7. "Too far," Sarah countered. "We need something closer. The chemical storage area is just past Section C. They keep concentrated sulfuric acid there for the cleanroom protocols." I understood immediately. Acid might slow them down, or stop them completely if we get it into their brain tissue, Sarah added. The metal hatch above us buckled with a loud bang. We needed to move. "Lead the way," I told Sarah, who had memorized the facility layout years ago. We moved as quickly as we dared in the dim light, following the blue strips along the floor. The tunnel curved and branched, forming a maze beneath the main facility. Sarah took each turn without hesitation, while I kept close behind her. The others followed, with Marcus bringing up the rear. After several minutes of hurried movement, Marcus stopped. "This is where we split up," he announced. "B7 junction is through that passage." He pointed to a side tunnel. "I'm going for the armory. We need real weapons, not makeshift chemical bombs." "We should stay together," I argued. "More chances for survival if we split up," he countered. "2 teams, 2 objectives." Before I could argue further, he gestured to Peterson and one of the other researchers, Dr. Ramirez. "You 2, with me." Peterson looked uncertain, but followed when Ramirez did. The three of them disappeared down the side tunnel, leaving me with Sarah, Chen, and Dr. Taylor, a quiet virologist who'd barely spoken since the outbreak began. "We should keep moving," Sarah urged, tugging at my sleeve. We continued through the tunnels, the blue emergency lighting creating strange shadows as we moved. The metal walls amplified every sound, our breathing, our footsteps, the distant banging of infected trying to break through barriers somewhere in the facility. A scream echoed through the tunnels, distant but unmistakable. Then another, cut short. We all froze. "Marcus," Chen whispered. "Or the others," I said. "We can't go back for them." Sarah nodded grimly and pressed forward. The tunnels narrowed even further, forcing us to crouch as we moved. I felt the walls pressing in around me, the air growing stale. We must have been in a section rarely accessed by maintenance. Sarah suddenly stopped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh God," she murmured. In the blue light, I saw what had caused her reaction. Her hand had brushed against something on the floor. A human arm, severed at the elbow, the flesh still warm to the touch. Blood pooled beneath it, black in the dim lighting. "Keep moving," I said, helping her step over it. "Nothing we can do." We continued in silence, the encounter adding new urgency to our pace. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only minutes, Sarah stopped at a junction marked with a chemical hazard symbol. "Here," she said, pointing to a maintenance door. "This should lead directly into the chemical storage area." I tried the handle. Locked. "Stand back," I said, before ramming my shoulder against it. The door gave way on the second attempt, swinging open to reveal a room lined with shelves of chemical containers. We filed in quickly, and Chen and Taylor helped me drag a heavy storage cabinet in front of the door. It wouldn't hold against a determined assault, but it might buy us precious time. The chemical storage room was larger than I expected, with high ceilings and ventilation ducts running across the top. The walls were lined with shelves containing clearly labeled containers of various sizes. Emergency lighting bathed everything in that same blue glow we'd seen in the tunnels. "Here," Sarah said, moving to a shelf marked with acid warnings. She pulled down a container of sulfuric acid, carefully setting it on a center workbench. "We need something to deliver it with." Dr. Taylor moved to a supply cabinet and returned with a box of large-gauge syringes. "Will these work?" Sarah nodded. "Perfect. Adrian, help me fill these. We need to aim for the head, eyes, mouth, any direct route to neural tissue." We worked quickly, filling syringes with the caustic liquid and carefully capping them. I distributed them among our group, each of us taking 3. "How do we use these without splashing ourselves?" Chen asked, holding a syringe nervously. "Keep your distance, aim, and depress the plunger quickly," Sarah instructed. "One good shot to the face should disable them long enough for us to get away." Through the ventilation grates near the ceiling, I heard sounds that made my skin crawl. Shuffling movements and strange, wet breathing. The infected were moving through the facility above us, searching. Sarah set up her laptop on the workbench, connecting it to a small portable drive she'd taken from the lab. The screen illuminated her face with harsh white light as she began analyzing data. "What are you doing?" I asked, moving to her side. "Trying to find a way to neutralize the organism," she explained, her fingers moving rapidly over the keyboard. "If I can isolate the protein markers in the original serum that trigger resurrection, I might be able to create something that reverses the process." Chen and Taylor took up positions near the barricaded door, each holding a syringe at the ready. I stood beside Sarah, watching the complex molecular models rotating on her screen. That's when I noticed it. A dark stain on the sleeve of her lab coat. Blood. "You're hurt," I said, gently taking her arm. She pulled away without looking up from the screen. "It's nothing. Just cut myself on some broken glass when we were escaping. I'm fine." But I could see she wasn't fine. Her skin looked paler than usual, and a light sheen of sweat had broken out across her forehead. I remembered all too well how quickly Andrew had turned after being bitten. This was a cut, not a bite, but if the organism was in her bloodstream. "Sarah," I said quietly, so the others couldn't hear, "we need to look at that wound." "Later," she insisted. "I'm close to something here. The organism has a unique cell wall structure. If we can disrupt it with the right chemical compound." A loud bang from the door cut her off. The cabinet we'd pushed against it shuddered. "They found us," Taylor whispered, backing away from the door. Another bang, stronger this time. The cabinet shifted an inch away from the door. I could hear them on the other side, that same wet, ragged breathing we'd heard through the vents, but closer now, much closer. "How many do you think?" Chen asked, his voice quavering. The cabinet moved another inch. Through the widening gap, I caught a glimpse of milky white eyes and blood-stained lab coats. "Too many," I answered, moving to stand between the door and Sarah. I raised one of the acid-filled syringes, aiming it at the gap. "Sarah, whatever you're working on, do it faster." The barricade continued to give way inch by inch as the infected pushed against it with relentless force. We were trapped in the storage room with limited weapons and nowhere to run. Sarah worked frantically at her laptop, racing against time as our makeshift defenses began to fail. The barricade wouldn't hold much longer. Each impact pushed the cabinet another inch from the door, revealing more of those milky white eyes and blood-stained faces on the other side. "We need to move." I grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her away from the laptop. She resisted, trying to save the data she'd been analyzing. "Just 10 more seconds," she insisted, her fingers still flying over the keyboard. I noticed her hands trembling slightly, her skin looking paler under the harsh blue emergency lighting. "No time," I said, yanking a small portable drive from the computer and shoving it into my pocket. I caught a glimpse of the molecular models on her screen, complex protein structures that might hold the key to stopping this nightmare. The cabinet slid another few inches. An arm squeezed through the gap, fingers curling in the air like claws. "The connecting lab," Sarah pointed to a door at the far side of the storage room. "Through there." Chen and Taylor had already abandoned their positions near the barricade, backing toward us with their acid-filled syringes held out like weapons. "We'll hold them off," Chen said, his voice steadier than I expected. "You get Sarah through that door." Taylor nodded in agreement, his face set with grim determination. "The serum research is more important than any of us now." I wanted to argue, to find a way for all of us to escape, but the barricade gave way with a final crash. The cabinet toppled forward as infected poured into the room, former colleagues with vacant eyes and blood-smeared lab coats. Chen immediately stepped forward, driving a syringe toward the face of the first infected. The acid hit its mark, splashing across eyes and flesh. The creature howled, the first sound I'd heard any of them make, as its facial tissue began to dissolve. "Go," Taylor shouted, thrusting his own syringe at another infected. I half-dragged Sarah toward the connecting door, my free hand fumbling with the handle. It was locked. I slammed my shoulder against it once, twice, 3 times, before the frame splintered and the door gave way. As we stumbled through, I looked back just in time to see Chen go down under a wave of bodies, his scream cut short as teeth tore into his throat. Taylor was backing away, his last syringe empty, surrounded by advancing infected. I pulled Sarah through the doorway and slammed what remained of the door shut, turning the lock for whatever good it might do. The adjacent lab was dark except for the same emergency lighting that ran throughout the facility. Equipment stood in shadowy silhouettes, centrifuges, microscopes, computer terminals. "Help me with this," I gasped, pushing a heavy metal desk toward the door. Sarah tried to help but stumbled, catching herself against a lab bench. That's when I got my first good look at her in proper lighting. Her face was ashen, sweat beading across her forehead and upper lip. The cut on her arm that she'd dismissed as nothing had turned into something horrific. Black veins spread outward from the wound like ink bleeding into paper, already reaching past her elbow. Her breathing came in shallow gasps. "Sarah," I said, moving to her side after wedging the desk against the door. "Let me see." She pulled away weakly. "Doesn't matter. We need to." She swayed on her feet. I caught her before she fell, feeling the heat radiating from her body. Her fever had spiked impossibly fast. I helped her to a chair, my mind racing. The infection was spreading through her system just as it had with Andrew and the others, but slower. Maybe because it was from a cut rather than a bite. "You need to leave me," she said, her voice suddenly clear and focused despite her deteriorating condition. "Find somewhere safe. The data, the drive. You need to get it out." "I'm not leaving you," I said, tearing through drawers and cabinets, looking for anything that might help. Banging started on the door we'd just come through. Wood splintered as the infected tried to break through our makeshift barricade. "Adrian, please." Sarah grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "I can feel it, changing me. There's not much time." I stared at her, my brilliant, beautiful wife, watching as those black veins crept higher up her arm. Then my eyes fell on her laptop, still clutched in her other hand. "The serum," I said, "the one you were modeling. Could it work?" "Theoretically. It targets the unique cell wall structure of the organism." Her speech was becoming slurred. "But it's untested. I'd need to synthesize." "What if it's already synthesized?" I interrupted, moving to a refrigerated storage unit against the wall. This was one of the secondary research labs where we'd run dozens of variations on the original serum. "What about the beta compound? The one we shelved because it was too toxic to the host?" Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. "It might work, temporarily. The molecular binding would disrupt the organism's replication cycle, but the toxicity..." "Better than the alternative," I said, pulling open the refrigerator door. Inside, neatly labeled vials glowed with familiar blue luminescence, variations on the original Lazarus serum, each with different molecular modifications. I grabbed vial B17, the compound Sarah had deemed too dangerous for our resurrection trials months ago. The warning label couldn't have been clearer. Toxic to mammalian tissue, not for clinical use. Sarah's head lolled to one side, her eyes struggling to focus on me. The black veins had reached her shoulder now, spreading toward her neck. "Let me go," she whispered. "Please." The door behind us shuddered as something heavy slammed against it. The desk moved an inch. I filled a syringe with the blue liquid, my hands steadier than they had any right to be. "This might kill you," I said, positioning the needle at the base of her skull, the same injection site we'd used on the dog. "I'm already dead," she replied, her voice so quiet I barely heard it over the sounds of the infected trying to break in. I pushed the plunger. The blue liquid disappeared into her body. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then Sarah's body went rigid. Her back arched in the chair, muscles contracting so violently I feared her spine might snap. Her mouth opened in a silent scream as convulsions racked her body. I held her as best I could, trying to keep her from injuring herself further. The convulsions grew more intense, her limbs thrashing with such force that I nearly lost my grip. The door behind us gave way with a crash. I looked back to see infected pouring into the room, Chen and Taylor among them, their lab coats torn and bloody, their eyes that same terrible milky white. I dragged Sarah's convulsing body behind a heavy lab bench, putting a barrier between us and the immediate threat. The infected swarmed over the fallen desk, moving through the lab with that jerky, puppet-like motion. Sarah's convulsions suddenly stopped. Her body went completely limp in my arms. For one horrible moment, I thought she was dead, truly dead. Then her chest rose with a shallow breath. The fever that had been burning through her moments before seemed to break. The black veins spreading across her skin stopped advancing, though they didn't recede. "Sarah," I whispered, acutely aware of the infected searching the lab just yards away. Her eyes fluttered open, normal, human eyes, not the milky whiteness of the infected. She looked up at me, confusion giving way to recognition. "Adrian," she murmured. "Did it work?" "I think so," I said, helping her sit up. "How do you feel?" "Strange, clearer, but..." She glanced down at her arm, where the black veins remained like a tattoo under her skin. "It's still there. I can feel it." We crouched behind the lab bench, listening to the sounds of the infected moving through the room. They hadn't spotted us yet, but it was only a matter of time. "We need to find somewhere more secure," I whispered. Sarah nodded, already looking stronger by the minute. She pointed to a door on the far side of the lab. "Supply closet, reinforced for chemical storage." We stayed low, moving from bench to bench, using the lab equipment as cover. The infected seemed to be searching methodically, their movements becoming more coordinated than before. It was as if they were learning, adapting. We made it to the supply closet unseen. I eased the door open, ushering Sarah inside before following and pulling it shut behind us. The small room was lined with shelves of chemicals and equipment. No windows, no other exits, but solid walls and a heavy door we could secure from inside. I locked the door and added a metal bar from one of the shelves as an extra barricade. The space was tight, maybe 8 by 10 feet, but defensible. Sarah sank down against the wall, her breathing steadier now. For almost 20 minutes, we sat in silence, listening to the occasional sound of infected moving in the lab outside. The modified serum seemed to be working. The black veins on her arm hadn't spread further. "You should have left me," she finally said, breaking the silence. "That was never an option." She smiled, a weak but genuine smile that reminded me of the woman I'd fallen in love with years ago. Always the hero. "Hardly," I said, checking the wound on her arm. The skin around it looked less inflamed, though the black veins remained visible. "How's the pain?" "Manageable. My head is clearer than it's been since this started." She leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes briefly. "But it won't last." "What do you mean?" She opened her eyes, meeting my gaze directly. "The serum has a fatal flaw, Adrian. It's only delaying the inevitable." "You don't know that," I argued. "You're getting better." "No, I'm not. I can feel it. The organism is still there, just temporarily suppressed." She took my hand, her fingers cold against my skin. "It's already reached my brain. That's why the convulsions stopped so suddenly. The serum interrupted the neural integration process, but it can't reverse it. I refused to accept what she was telling me. Then we'll make a stronger version, more concentrated. There's no time. She squeezed my hand, and the toxicity levels are already at the maximum a human body can withstand. Any more would kill me outright. There has to be something we can do, I insisted. Sarah's expression softened. You're a scientist, Adrian. Look at the evidence, not what you want to believe. She was right, of course. The modified serum had bought us time, nothing more. The organism was too aggressive, too adaptable. Once it reached the brain, there was no coming back. How long? I asked, my voice breaking despite my efforts to stay calm. Minutes, maybe an hour at most. She leaned her head against my shoulder. I wanted to tell you something before I can't anymore. I put my arm around her, pulling her closer. I'm listening. The organism, it's not what we thought. It's not creating new life. It's hijacking existing neural pathways to replicate itself. She spoke quickly now, as if racing against time. It's ancient, Adrian, not alien, not engineered. It's been here all along, dormant in the deeper soil samples we collected. Project Lazarus just woke it up, I finished, the implications hitting me all at once. Exactly. And now it's awake, adaptive, and spreading. She shuddered against me. Promise me you'll stop it, whatever it takes. I promise, I said, pressing my lips to her forehead. We sat like that for several minutes, holding each other in the small closet while Infected prowled the lab outside. I almost let myself believe we might find a way out of this together. Then Sarah stiffened in my arms. Adrian, she said, her voice suddenly strained. It's happening. I pulled back to look at her face. The black veins had begun spreading up her neck, creeping toward her jawline. Fight it, I urged, gripping her shoulders. Stay with me. I'm trying. Her breathing became labored again, her eyes focusing and unfocusing. There's a kill switch in the main control room. Flood the facility with concentrated serum. It will kill everything, including... She stopped mid-sentence, her body going rigid. I watched in horror as the darkness spread across her face, tracing veins up to her temples. Sarah. Sarah. Her eyes snapped open, but they were no longer hers. The warm green I knew so well had been replaced by that milky white opacity that marked the infected. I scrambled backward as Sarah, no, not Sarah anymore, just a thing wearing her body, stood up with that unnatural jerky motion I'd seen in the dog, in Andrew, in all the others, her head tilted, studying me as if I were prey. I backed up until I hit the shelves behind me, my hand groping blindly for anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers closed around something metallic, a surgical blade still in its sterile packaging. I tore it open as the thing that had been my wife moved toward me, her movements becoming more fluid, more predatory with each step. In the confined space of the closet, there was nowhere to run. I held the blade out in front of me, my back pressed against the shelves. Sarah, if you're still in there somewhere. No response. Just that blank stare and mechanical advance. She lunged with shocking speed, hands reaching for my throat. I ducked to the side, but in the tight space, I couldn't avoid her completely. Her fingers caught my lab coat, pulling me off balance. We crashed into the shelves, sending chemicals and equipment crashing to the floor. I struggled to keep the blade between us as she pushed me down, her strength far greater than Sarah's had ever been. Her face was inches from mine now, teeth bared. This wasn't my wife anymore. Sarah was gone. With a surge of desperate strength, I drove the surgical blade upward through the soft underside of her jaw and into her brain. Her body went rigid, then limp, collapsing on top of me. I held her as she fell, cradling her head against my chest one last time. Blood, darker than it should have been, seeped from the wound, staining my already ruined lab coat. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I knew she couldn't hear me anymore. "I'm so sorry." I gently laid her body aside and got to my feet. My legs shook, threatening to give way beneath me. I leaned against the wall, trying to process what I'd just done, what I'd lost. A splintering sound from the closet door yanked me back to reality. The infected in the lab had heard our struggle. They were trying to break through. The door shuddered under repeated impacts. The metal bar I'd used to barricade it bent slightly with each hit. Dozens of infected were pressing against it. I could hear them on the other side, that wet, ragged breathing multiplied into a grotesque chorus. I looked around the small closet, searching for options. No other exits. No weapons except the bloody surgical blade still in my hand. Just shelves of chemicals and the body of my wife at my feet. The door bent inward, wood splintering around the frame. I had minutes, maybe seconds, before they broke through completely. The door to the supply closet bent inward, the metal bar warping under the relentless pressure from outside. I had seconds, maybe less, before the infected broke through. My eyes darted upward, spotting the ventilation grate in the ceiling, a standard feature in chemical storage areas to prevent dangerous fumes from building up. I moved quickly, pushing a wheeled cart beneath the vent. With one last look at Sarah's body on the floor, I climbed onto the cart, which wobbled precariously under my weight. The surgical blade I'd used to kill my wife was still clutched in my blood-slicked hand. I jammed it into the edge of the grate, using it as a makeshift screwdriver to loosen the fasteners. Fingers pushed through the widening gaps, grasping blindly at the air. The cart shifted beneath me as I worked frantically, my hands shaking. One fastener came loose, then another. I pushed upward on the grate, bending it enough to create an opening. The metal bar finally gave way as the door crashed inward. Infected poured into the small space just as I pulled myself up into the ventilation shaft. A hand grabbed my ankle. I kicked hard, feeling bone crack under my heel, and pulled myself fully into the duct. The ventilation system was larger than I expected, designed to handle the extensive air circulation requirements of a subterranean research facility. I crawled forward on my hands and knees, putting distance between myself and the supply closet behind me. The metal duct creaked under my weight, but held. The sounds of the infected faded as I moved deeper into the ventilation network. Their growls and wet breathing gave way to the mechanical hum of air circulation fans. The facility's systems were still functioning, keeping the containment protocols active, recycling the air, maintaining power. It was almost absurd how the automated infrastructure continued operating while human life was being extinguished below. I paused at a junction to get my bearings. The ventilation system followed the layout of the facility, and I had spent enough years in Eden to navigate by memory. The main control room would be 3 sections north, then east past the executive offices. It was the most secure location in the facility, with reinforced doors and independent emergency systems. Moving as quietly as possible, I continued crawling through the metal passages. Light filtered up through vents below me, offering glimpses into the nightmare Eden had become. I passed over a break room where 3 infected researchers were hunched over what remained of a security guard. The wet sounds of feeding made my stomach lurch. The executive office section was next. Through the vents, I saw Director Marcus's spacious office, his desk overturned and papers scattered across the floor. His private bathroom door was ajar, a trail of blood leading inside. I kept moving. The administrative area was worse. At least 12 infected wandered the open space, some standing motionless, while others moved with that horrible jerky gait between cubicles. Bodies lay everywhere, administrative staff who hadn't stood a chance when the outbreak spread to their level. Some had been partially consumed, others simply killed in the initial wave. The ventilation duct narrowed as I approached the control room sector. The air felt cooler here, filtered through additional systems to maintain the sensitive electronic equipment below. I had to shimmy through on my belly, pushing with my toes and pulling with my fingertips. Finally, I reached the vent above the main control room. Through the grate, I could see the bank of monitors covering the far wall, their screens showing various areas of the facility. The room appeared empty. I removed the grate as quietly as possible and lowered myself down, dropping the last few feet onto the floor with a soft thud. The control room was designed as Eden's nerve center, a horseshoe of computer stations facing a wall of monitors, with additional terminals along the sides for specialized systems. The air had that distinct ozone smell of electronics running hot. The main lights were off, but the screens and indicator LEDs provided enough illumination to see. I moved immediately to the door, engaging the emergency lockdown protocol. Thick metal bolts slid into place with a reassuring clunk. It wouldn't hold forever against a determined assault, but it would buy me time. With the room secured, I turned to the monitors. Each screen showed a different section of Eden, live feeds from security cameras throughout the facility. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. Every level, every section was overrun. The cafeteria cameras showed at least 30 infected moving among overturned tables. The medical bay was worse. Doctors and nurses who had tried to treat the early victims now shambled through blood-soaked corridors. The residential quarters, where off-duty staff slept during extended projects, had become a hunting ground, with infected breaking down doors to reach those who had barricaded themselves inside. I checked the personnel tracking system. Eden had maintained a real-time count of everyone inside the facility for security purposes. The display showed 217 personnel currently on site. Not a single emergency evacuation had been logged. Everyone was still here, either turned or dead. The realization hit me like a physical blow. There was no rescue coming, no containment team to secure the situation. The infection had spread too quickly, too completely. Eden was lost. I sank into the command chair, my exhausted body finally registering the cuts and bruises from my desperate escape. My lab coat was stiff with dried blood, Sarah's blood. The memory of what I'd had to do in that supply closet crashed over me again. Sarah's face as the infection took her, the surgical blade in my hand, her body going limp in my arms. I forced the thoughts away. There would be time for grief later, or more likely, there wouldn't be. Right now, I needed to focus on containment. I pulled up the emergency protocols on the main terminal. Eden had been designed with multiple fail-safes, as any facility handling potentially dangerous biological materials must be. Most were already active. The surface locks had sealed automatically when the lockdown initiated, preventing anything from reaching the outside world. But there was one final option, listed under catastrophic containment measures: a complete purge of the facility through specialized vents that would flood every room, corridor, and space with a concentrated version of the same serum that had failed to save Sarah. The substance would kill everything organic within the facility, infected, uninfected. All biological material would be broken down at the cellular level. It was a doomsday option designed for exactly this scenario, when the risk of external contamination outweighed all other considerations. The facility would become a tomb, and I would be buried with it. My hands hovered over the keyboard. Was there another way? Could some part of the facility be saved? Could I somehow escape to the surface with Sarah's research? The security feed from outside the control room answered my questions. Infected were gathering in the corridor, drawn perhaps by some sixth sense to the last uninfected human in the complex. They pressed against the reinforced door, their bodies creating a grotesque pile as more arrived behind them. I activated the failsafe sequence. The system requested confirmation. Warning of complete organic dissolution throughout the facility. I confirmed and set the timer for 15 minutes. Enough time to make sure everything was properly documented. The countdown began on every screen in the room. 15 minutes until Eden ceased to exist as anything but a sterile hole in the ground. I accessed the emergency broadcast system next, a direct line to the military command that oversaw Project Lazarus. The connection still worked. The infection hadn't compromised our external communications. I recorded a message, keeping my voice as steady as possible. This is Dr. Adrian Cole at Eden Research Facility. We have experienced a catastrophic containment breach of Project Lazarus. The organism has infected the entire facility population. I have activated the emergency serum flood protocol, which should neutralize all organic material within the facility. If this fails, immediate nuclear sterilization is recommended. The organism is highly aggressive, transmitted through fluid contact, and appears airborne in dormant state. Under no circumstances should Eden be reopened. I repeat, under no circumstances should Eden be reopened. I transmitted the message, hoping it would reach General Patricia directly. She would understand the severity, would make the hard calls if the serum flood failed. The door shuddered as the infected outside redoubled their efforts. The reinforced metal bent slightly at the center, still holding but weakening. The countdown showed 12 minutes remaining. I turned to the research database, pulling up Sarah's most recent findings. She had been trying to tell me something in her final lucid moments, something about the organism itself. I found her notes from earlier that day before everything went wrong. Organism analysis complete, she had written. Not extraterrestrial as initially theorized. Genetic markers indicate terrestrial origin, likely prehistoric. Carbon dating of dormant spores from deepest soil samples suggests the organism has been dormant for approximately 2.7 million years. Hypothesis: the organism entered dormancy during the late Pliocene extinction event, preserving itself in deeper soil layers. Her notes continued, growing more urgent. The organism appears designed to survive extinction events by hijacking existing neural architecture of higher organisms. It doesn't create new life. It preserves itself by commandeering the neural pathways of its hosts. Our serum didn't create resurrection. It simply provided the catalyst for the organism's awakening. We didn't create new life. We woke up something ancient that should have stayed buried. The implication was staggering. Project Lazarus hadn't created a miracle. We had unleashed something prehistoric, something that evolution had tried to eradicate millions of years ago. The extinction event that should have wiped it out had merely driven it underground, into dormancy, waiting for someone foolish enough to wake it. 8 minutes remained on the countdown. The door buckled further, the metal screaming as it bent inward. I could see faces pressed against the widening gaps, former colleagues with milky white eyes and blood-stained skin. I switched the monitors to the external cameras, wanting one last look at the world above. The Nevada desert stretched out under a clear blue sky. Just half a mile from Eden's hidden entrance, life continued normally. The containment had held so far. No one above ground knew what had happened beneath their feet. The thought offered some comfort. At least the outbreak had been contained to Eden. At least Sarah's death, all these deaths, wouldn't be in vain. 5 minutes. The door's integrity was failing faster now. The central locking mechanism groaned as multiple bodies pressed against it. I moved away from the command console, backing toward the far side of the room. There were no other exits, nowhere else to run. I found myself thinking about Sarah, not as I had last seen her, with black veins spreading across her skin and milky white eyes, but as she had been that morning. Her auburn hair tied back, her green eyes bright with excitement about the day's experiment. She had kissed me and said something about dinner plans. Such a normal moment, the last normal moment we would ever share. The memory brought a surprising calm. In a way, I was glad I wouldn't have to live in a world without her, that we would, in some sense, leave together. 3 minutes remained when the door finally gave way. The metal frame tore from the wall as dozens of infected pushed through the opening, stumbling over each other in their eagerness to reach me. They filled the control room, moving with that terrible coordination that suggested shared purpose. I backed up against the window overlooking the central atrium, watching as they approached. In their faces, I recognized people I had worked with for years. Researchers, security personnel, maintenance staff, all reduced to vessels for an organism that had waited millions of years for this moment. The countdown continued its relentless progress. 2 minutes. The infected moved closer, backing me into the corner. I clutched the edge of the console, preparing for the end. I thought of Sarah one last time, her smile, her laugh, the way she could solve complex equations in her head faster than most people could type them into a calculator. I thought of our first date, our wedding day, the life we had built together in service of what we believed was a noble scientific pursuit. 1 minute remained. The first infected reached me, hands grasping at my lab coat. I pushed it back, but there were too many behind it. They surrounded me, pressing closer, their cold hands reaching for exposed skin. The facility's speakers crackled to life, announcing the final countdown. Emergency protocol activated, serum dispersal in 30 seconds. I closed my eyes as the infected closed in, their breath hot against my face. I had done everything I could. Eden would be cleansed. The organism would die with us. The countdown reached 0. The infected poured through the shattered doorway like a wave of broken humanity. Milky eyes, bloodied lab coats, and grasping hands reaching toward me. The last uninfected person in Eden. With barely 3 minutes left on the countdown, I scrambled backward onto the main control console, knocking over monitors and keyboards in my desperate retreat. My hand closed around something solid, a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall behind the console. I yanked it free as the first infected lunged at me. A woman whose name tag read Dr. Levine, though nothing of Levine remained behind those vacant eyes. I swung the extinguisher in a wide arc, connecting with her skull with a sickening crack. She dropped to the floor, but was immediately replaced by 2 more, a security guard and what had once been a janitor. I kicked the guard back, buying myself seconds as I twisted to face the others. "Stay back," I shouted, though I knew they couldn't understand, couldn't be reasoned with. The words were more for me than them, a last desperate grasp at humanity, in a room that had lost all trace of it. 2 minutes, 30 seconds. I smashed the extinguisher down on another head, feeling bone give way beneath the metal cylinder. Dark blood splattered across the console screens, obscuring the countdown momentarily. I swung again and again, my arms burning with exertion as I fought to keep the space around me clear. A hand grabbed my ankle. I looked down to see Andrew, what remained of Andrew, pulling himself up the side of the console toward me. His lab coat was shredded, revealing the bullet holes in his chest that hadn't stopped him before and wouldn't stop him now. I slammed the base of the extinguisher down onto his fingers, crushing them against the edge of the console. He didn't flinch, didn't release his grip. I hit him again, harder, finally breaking his hold. 2 minutes. The infected kept coming. For every one I knocked back, 2 more took its place. My breath came in ragged gasps, my muscles screaming from the continuous effort. I knew I couldn't keep this up. Not for 2 more minutes, maybe not even for 1. Something sharp tore into my calf. I looked down to see teeth sinking into my leg. An infected crawling beneath the console had found me. I yelled in pain and bashed the extinguisher against the side of its head until it released me. Too late. I could already feel it, the burning sensation spreading from the wound, the infection entering my bloodstream. 1 minute, 30 seconds. I fought with renewed desperation now, not to save myself. That was already impossible, but to make the seconds count, to ensure Eden remained sealed, to fulfill my promise to Sarah. The memory of her green eyes flashed through my mind, cutting through the chaos around me. Sarah in the lab on our first day at Eden, excited about the possibilities ahead of us. Sarah laughing at something I'd said over coffee in the break room. 1 minute. I dropped the dented, blood-covered extinguisher and lunged for the central terminal. My fingers flew across the keyboard, initiating the final containment protocol, the one that would seal Eden permanently, beyond any possibility of remote override. Complete facility lockdown, confirm YN, flashed on the screen. I slammed my finger on the Y key, just as an infected researcher grabbed my shoulder, pulling me backward. I twisted away, feeling my lab coat tear as I fought to stay at the terminal. Lockdown confirmed, manual override disabled. 30 seconds. The burning in my leg had intensified, spreading upward through my veins. I could feel the organism moving through my system, faster than it had with Sarah. The bite transmitted more of the infection than her cut had. My vision blurred around the edges as I kicked and punched at the wall of infected surrounding me. My movements were becoming uncoordinated, not from the infection, not yet, but from sheer exhaustion. 15 seconds. The facility speakers crackled to life. Serum dispersal imminent. Clear all ventilation access points. I grabbed the edge of the console to steady myself as a wave of dizziness washed over me. The infected pressed closer, hands grasping at my clothing, my limbs, my face. 10 seconds. The nearest monitor showed a schematic of Eden, all sections marked in red, indicating complete infection throughout the facility. Soon they would all be blue, neutralized, dead. 5 seconds. I thought of Sarah one last time, not as I'd last seen her, but as she'd been on our wedding day. Her laugh as we danced, her whispered words that only I could hear. 0. With a mechanical hiss, the emergency vents throughout Eden slid open. Thick blue mist, the concentrated serum, poured into every room, every corridor, every corner of the facility. Through the control room's windows, I watched it billow through the central atrium, beautiful and deadly. The effect on the infected was immediate and horrifying. The nearest ones staggered backward, their movements becoming even more jerky and uncoordinated. One dropped to its knees, milky eyes rolling upward as its skin began to bubble. Another clawed at its throat, mouth opening and closing without sound. I tried to hold my breath, knowing it was pointless. The serum filled the control room, surrounding me in a blue haze that sparkled under the emergency lights. My lungs burned, demanding air. When I finally gasped, the pain was immediate, like inhaling liquid fire. The infected were dissolving around me. Their skin sloughed away in wet chunks, revealing muscle and bone that quickly followed. They collapsed into puddles of organic matter, still moving, still trying to reach me even as they liquefied. My own skin began to burn. I looked down at my hands to see the first signs, red blisters forming, then breaking open as the serum attacked my cellular structure. The bite wound on my leg had turned black, the flesh around it already starting to disintegrate. I fell to my knees, no longer able to support my own weight. Through blurring vision, I watched the monitors showing Eden's final moments. Empty corridors filled with blue fog. Labs where puddles of what had once been researchers stained the floor. The residential quarters where nothing moved but the slowly settling mist. The pain was beyond anything I could have imagined. Worse than any injury, any illness. Every breath brought more serum into my lungs, breaking down tissue from the inside out. I tasted blood and something else, something worse, my own dissolving organs. My legs gave way completely as the muscles separated from bone. I collapsed beside the console, no longer able to move. The infection that had been spreading through my system fought against the serum, creating a war inside my body with only one possible outcome. Through the agony, I found myself thinking about time. How it had seemed so abundant when Sarah and I started at Eden. How we'd planned for years of research, decades of marriage. How quickly it had all vanished. My vision darkened at the edges. The blue mist seemed to pulse with each beat of my failing heart. I tried to form Sarah's name with lips that were no longer there. My last coherent thought was of Sarah's laugh on our wedding day, the sound of it echoing through the reception hall as I twirled her across the dance floor. How alive we had been, how in love, how certain of our future together. Then darkness. 3 black military helicopters circled the desert above Eden's hidden entrance. Humvees formed a perimeter around the small, unassuming concrete structure that served as the facility's only connection to the outside world. Armed soldiers maintained a safe distance, weapons trained on the entrance, though nothing had emerged for hours. General Patricia stood beside her command vehicle, her face impassive as she listened to the final transmission from below. "This is Dr. Adrian Cole at Eden Research Facility." The message played through her radio for the 3rd time. She heard the exhaustion in his voice, the resignation. She had met Cole once, at a project review 6 months earlier. A brilliant man, dedicated, now another casualty. When the message ended, she turned to her second in command. "Begin the sealing procedure. I want that entrance buried under 20 feet of reinforced concrete by nightfall." "Yes, ma'am." He hesitated. "What about the other staff? Could there be survivors?" General Patricia's grey eyes hardened. "You heard Dr. Cole. Complete organic dissolution. There are no survivors." She looked toward the entrance, a barely visible bunker door set into the rocky landscape. "This is now a permanent exclusion zone. No personnel in or out ever. Establish the security perimeter according to Protocol Omega." "And the official report?" "Gas leak. Tragic accident. 217 personnel lost." She turned away from the entrance. the truth stays buried with them. 3 days later, thermal imaging confirmed what General Patricia already knew. No heat signatures, no movement, no life signs of any kind beneath the desert floor. Eden became a tomb, its secrets buried with the 217 people who died there.